Alec, Peirce, Scuba. Hi guys, I'm here again with another tech tip. A little bit of information that just might make your diving more fun, a little easier, maybe safer as well. And certainly for those people out there that are a little more technically inclined, those people that maybe change their own tires, check their own brakes, check their own oil and stuff like that, then these might be really valuable to you, some of these. Anyway, O-rings. Whoop-de-doo, O-rings. You've all heard the term O-rings. Usually your experience with O-rings is that the O-ring on your tank leaks, and so the dive master in the boat changes the O-ring and you go diving. Whoop-de-doo, it's over. O-rings are critical. O-rings are absolutely critical. In fact, the development of Scuba was held up a little bit, waiting for O-rings to come along. You see, originally we didn't have O-rings. Back in the 50s and the early 60s, there were no O-rings. We had plastic. And the valves on the tanks, I don't have one to show you right now, but the valve, you look at the valve and the face of a valve, here's a typical valve, has an O-ring in there, you know what this looks like. The old ones didn't have that. They had a flat piece of white plastic, and they didn't seal. What you had to do, you put the regulator on, and then you put it on really tightly and move it a bit and put it on really tightly, which you're not supposed to do. You don't have to do with O-rings, because the regulator would then be pushed into the plastic, make an impression, and it would seal. And you could do that quite a while before you had to replace the plastic washer is really what it was. With O-rings, you don't need to do that, because O-rings, because of their technology, and if you're not sure exactly how an O-ring works, because an O-ring actually works. It's not just a rubber ring. There's more to it than that. It's pretty interesting. Go to Google. How does an O-ring work? It's pretty interesting. Well, the modern regulator, you put the regulator on the valve, and you snugly turn the air on. The air actually helps the O-ring to seal. So O-rings are very, very important, and as I say, for a long time, Scuba development was held up a bit because there weren't good O-rings. Everything that moves, everything that seals in a Scuba regulator in particular, has to have an O-ring on it. And today, O-ring technology is very, very advanced. We have thousands of different sizes and for different fittings and different manufacturers from all over the world. And also different materials too. We'll talk briefly about that. But let me show you a couple of O-rings just to show you the variety. First of all, let me show you a mini O-ring. I don't even know if I can show you this. Can you see those O-ring here, Kevin? How can I put this on? The white top of the, Can you see that O-ring there, Kevin? You see that O-ring? Every one of you have two of these O-rings in your regulator, at least two. But two for sure. That little O-ring is critical because this fits onto a shaft. Every time you breathe, that shaft like this very quickly. And there's two of these O-rings, usually two of these O-rings on that shaft. Without that shaft, your regulator would free flow. It wouldn't work. It would blow air all the time. Those critical little O-rings. And of course, the O-rings vary. There's much bigger ones than this. This is an O-ring from a camera housing casing. Yes, cameras too, right. There's much bigger ones, large ones for DPVs and other types of items that are used underwater. So from a little bit tiny ones you can barely see, in fact we lose them all the time here at Scuba 2000, to the big ones. There's all kinds of them in between. Now as well, you may know this, you may not know this, O-rings come in different sizes. Well, I just showed you different sizes. No, that's not what I mean. What I mean is the O-ring, the material itself, has different sizes. So look at this O-ring. Okay, and compare that to this O-ring. Can you see that, Kevin? Yes. Obviously, it's a different diameter, but can you see the material is a different size? Yep. So when in the industry, if you're ordering or buying O-rings or checking O-rings, you need to have a device like this. It's called an O-ring gauge. Simple enough. And so you would take this O-ring, and around the edge of this gauge, there are holes in the side. So this O-ring fits into that hole perfectly. So I know that that O-ring is 0.139 cross section, 0.139 inches, or 139 thousandths of an inch, or 0.139, which is less than a quarter of an inch, or a lot less. So that fits in there. This O-ring, which is the other one I showed you, much, much smaller, it just fits in there neatly, just barely. So this one is 0.070. That's only 70 thousandths of an inch. And then there's bigger ones, and so on. So that's the first thing. You have to determine the diameter of the cross section. If you cut this O-ring, the cross section of the end, how big would that be? So that's one thing that varies. And then the second thing you use this device for is for measuring the diameter. That's pretty neat. It's a pretty simple device. You just drop it on the cone, make sure it's straight across, and then you read the size, which is directly above the O-ring. So this particular O-ring, I happen to know, is 2.033 thousandths of an inch. So that goes on there, and you can't measure the small one. But if you have a big one, you can drop the big one on. It's too big. There's a different way to measure that. Or you can drop this one on, and you see it goes down. You just read it. So this is a special device for measuring O-rings. And then if you look at an O-ring catalog, there's 40 pages in here. 40 pages like this. And these O-rings are all different material. No, these aren't different materials. These are all the same. All neoprene O-rings, but different diameters, different cross sections, and all different measurements. There's inside diameter. So O-ring technology today is actually very, very sophisticated. Now, for us in scuba diving, that's not terribly critical, because usually the O-ring, getting the right O-rings and installing them and lubricating them and so on is left up to your service person. And assuming he's a professional and does his job well, as we do here, then you won't have any problems. Let's talk very briefly about materials. This is a typical O-ring that goes into a valve face. This is the one that goes right in the valve. This is the one that always breaks down and leaks. That goes into the valve face. And you can see that that is black neoprene. We're going to call it black neoprene. Essentially it is. But you can see that this one is not black neoprene. No, this one is made of a different material. It's a plasticized material. We'll call it silicone for want of a better word. Same O-ring, different material. A little tougher, a little less or more resistant to ultraviolet sun and heat and salt. So this O-ring will last longer than this O-ring. So it's more expensive. So unfortunately, a lot of dive charters, they continue to buy the cheap ones and just change them regularly, often as they need to. And usually they change them when they need to, as opposed to when they ought to. But that happens sometimes. Now here's the third type of material. You can see this is different as well. This is can I hold all three of these? Not likely. But I'm going to try to hold all three of these. So you can see that brown color there, Kevin? Black, silicone, and brown. Now this brown one is different material. This is off the neck of a valve, and this is a different material entirely. This is called Veton, and there's different brand names and different types of material. But Veton is resistant to oxygen, doesn't deteriorate in oxygen. So if you were diving with enriched air of any sort, then your regulator and tank would have these O-rings. So this is the O-ring that goes onto the neck. This is the O-ring that goes into the face. And there are two other O-rings in this valve. This is a standard typical valve, just like the one you use every day when you're scuba diving. It has 4 O-rings on it. So please, I'm just trying to impress upon you that O-rings are important, first of all, and that O-ring technology today is very, very sophisticated. It's not just a matter of going to your plumber and saying, hey, that looks like the right size, and sticking it in. A little bit more to it. Now, secondly, what I wanted to do, and this is one of the most important things here, is talk briefly about lubricating O-rings. And in order to do that sufficiently and properly, I need to talk about 2 different types of functions of O-rings. Some O-rings seal. Okay, they seal. So typically is this O-ring here. This is a sealing O-ring. This is the O-ring. I'm going to take the one that you normally see, the black neoprene one. We'll call it neoprene. This is the O-ring that goes onto the neck of your valve, and this screws into the top of the tank. And this seals, it goes in snugly, and it seals the valve in the tank. So now the dive store can fill your tank at 3,000 psi, and the air will stay in the tank. Good news, right? So that's the O-ring there, a major O-ring. Seals the valve into the tank. It doesn't move, right? You get in the water and you suck the air out, and you take it so they fill it back up. But this O-ring doesn't move. This is called a static O-ring. It's a seal only. It doesn't move. Okay, now there are other O-rings. I mentioned earlier about this little, let me take that off of there. This little wee tiny O-ring I mentioned. A little wee tiny one here. And this, they're not all that small. But this little O-ring goes onto that shaft that I mentioned. And every time it sits there, sealing the air, okay, and then when you breathe, it pulls back like this, and you get air, and then it shuts again. Goes back. So this one goes back and forth, and it goes back and forth a lot. A lot of people think in the first stage in particular that when they breathe, the valve opens, and when I stop breathing, it closes. It doesn't do that. It actually oscillates. And maybe some of you have experienced the oscillation because you hear a whistle sometimes when you breathe. That is oscillating so fast, it's actually creating a sound. It's kind of like a wine glass. You wet your finger and go around the rim. That's oscillation. The glass is oscillating, vibrating, if you like. Well, this happens so quickly, you can't even see that device going back and forth. And that little O-ring is on that shaft, and it has to seal and move. That's called a dynamic O-ring, meaning it moves. Now, it still seals, but it moves as well. Obviously, those O-rings are under a lot more stress, wear, and tear than a static O-ring. Okay, so they also need proper care. And those O-rings, generally speaking, because they're on moving parts, are inside your regulator first and second stage. Both actually, first and second stage, they both have dynamic O-rings. And those O-rings will be replaced with factory-approved, original factory O-rings designed by the manufacturer for their model and changed, lubricated, changed, and then checked by a professional at the dive store. Okay, well, let's deal with lubrication, because this is a question that comes up very, very often. But before we, let's go to it. Let's go straight to it. Okay, here, Kevin, I'm going to hold this O-ring up here. You're going to have to zoom in on this one, because what I want you to see on this O-ring, does the weight help, Kevin?
Right there.
Does the weight help or no? That's okay, yeah. Right there. What I want you to see on here is that this O-ring is half lubricated. I don't know who's some idiot when he lubricated half. Can you see? I'm going to tip it a bit. Can you see a difference? Can you see that the bottom part, I'm going to go down here, is shiny? The top part is not shiny. Okay? The top part is not lubricated. The bottom part is. This was a dry O-ring that I pulled out of our O-ring stock. It had been there for quite some time, and the silicone had dissipated on it. The grease had dissipated and become a dry O-ring. And so for the purposes of this video, I properly lubricated 1/2 of the O-ring. Now take another look on there, Kevin. I'd like you to look in there again if you can. I'm sorry. Hold that still. I want you guys out there to take a look. Can you see any grease on that O-ring? Can you see any grease? Obviously on the lubricated, the bottom half, I think, in the picture. Can you see grease? The answer should be no. You can't see grease. You can see that it's glossy. Therefore, it is greased. But you can't see grease. If you look at an O-ring and you saw this, that's grease. That's grease. Okay? This is like the wheel bearings on your boat trailer. You put in lots in there. You're supposed to load them in there with you, but you shouldn't see that. Shouldn't be nearly that much. When we lubricate O-rings properly, here's what we do. You can watch from a distance now, Kevin. You take your finger's clean, of course, you've washed your hands, and here's your new tub of, in this particular case, O-ring lube, silicone grease, and you touch it. You touch the surface like that. So now your fingers are shiny, and then you take the O-ring between your fingers, and you go like this. You go all the way around. Sometimes you run out halfway around. You can feel it. You can feel it with your fingers. This takes practice. This is experience. This is why you go to a professional. He goes all the way around. And why am I using my fingers? Why don't I just dip it in the damn stuff? Well, there's a couple reasons for that. First of all, I have complete control over how much grease is being used. Okay? I don't want grease on there. I want the O-ring to be lubricated. Slight difference, but an important difference. And the second reason is that the warmth of my fingers helps. I can move and stretch a little bit, the O-ring, work that grease right in. Now, look at this O-ring up nice and close, and you'll see that this is a beautifully lubricated, glossy all over O-ring, the way it should be. Ready to go into your camera housing or your light or wherever else it has to be. That's proper lubrication. If you can see blobs of grease, if you can see grease on the O-ring, then you have on too much. That's not too much grease. Now there's some, before any of you techie guys out there give me a hard time, there are some applications where you actually do put on grease, usually in environmentally protected regulators or certain places where they're dynamic and they have to have a grease-filled area. But the actual O-ring itself does not have grease per se, not loaded in grease. So there's a little bit of information I want to share. One more thing with you. Be careful. Always read your owner's manuals for whatever product you have. Regulator, BC, camera housing, light, no matter what it is. Always read the owner's manuals before you start playing with the O-rings and greasing and so on. I'll tell you why. On some new products, most specifically cameras and lights, they don't use neoprene O-rings or any other type of O-ring. They use an O-ring, but it's silicone. It's a poured silicone O-ring. It's a little bit like our plastic ones from 50, 60 years ago. You don't grease them. In fact, if you grease them, it could be bad. You don't grease them. So just be careful, read your owner's manuals. Okay, guys? I hope that taught you a little bit about O-rings, different types of O-rings, and most importantly, how to lubricate them if you're doing it yourself. Don't go crazy with that grease. This tub of grease here, it'll last you about 20 years. You can actually go to your dive store, you can pick up for less than $10. You can buy a little tub of O-ring grease. That should last pretty much your whole diving career. You can also buy sprays. If you get a spray, sometimes you see silicone spray. If it's a spray like PAM, you push a button down and it sprays up. No, don't use that, because the accelerant, the propellant that pushes the silicone out is hard on rubber. You can use something like this. This is a food grade silicone, but this is silicone grease like that suspended in water. It's a pump, you see, and it's water. So you spray that on your hand, and your hand stays shiny, but the water goes away. Okay, so, but the best thing to do is to use a proper, decent quality, food grade at least, if not a specific O-ring grease like that. Okay, guys, that's enough. O-rings. If you have any questions or comments, send them to me. Great talking to you. Alec Peirce, Tech Tips.